Cubs win, Cubs win, Cubs win. Harry Carey, who never learned about contact lenses. I waited and waited and waited for the Cubs to win the World Series. And about a year before I retired from St. Peter's, Oakland, there was a cartoon that appeared, which I cut out and put on the bulletin board of the narthex. It showed hell frozen over, and Satan saying to the visitor, "Don't you know the Cubs won the World Series?" I became a Cubs fan in 1952 when that was an ontological impossibility that they would win the World Series. And look how long I waited until I was 78 of my 79 years. All good things come to those who wait and are steadfast. I will begin with those words. Why are we here tonight? I'm going to try to answer that question, and I'm going to do it in a way that was forbidden by my high school forensics coach, who was deathly afraid of the canned speech. But I'm going to deliver a canned speech tonight with some acerbic asides, à la notre président du présent, and to illuminate the past so that we may proceed to the future with confidence and joy and hope. We have just passed the 40th anniversary of the Congressman of Concerned Churchmen in St. Louis and the circulation of its reverent affirmation. After the Congress adjourned, it was ridiculed by liberal reductionist members of the church establishment and by the secular press. One prominent liberal writer described those in attendance as fat and extremist. The hostility of the secular press was not surprising, given the domination of the media by the National Council of Churches. As one of those derided, I am, 40 years later, still fat. But I am alive, relatively well, and not living in Argentina. The memory of that assembly is still very vivid, and the reason for calling the Congress remains ever so valid. The long-anticipated reality of priestesses revealed at the Minneapolis General Convention of 1976 was greeted by the secession of 4 parishes in the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles on January 22, 1977. 3 weeks later, 2 parishes of the Episcopal Diocese of California also seceded. The Los Angeles parishes were immediately sued for their property by the diocese. Not surprisingly, the secessions in Los Angeles prompted considerable publicity, especially in the Los Angeles Times. An amusing journalistic incident for me took place when a reporter from the minor Santa Monica Evening Outlook called for an interview. Her opening question was, "How could you take such a drastic action over something so frivolous as liturgical language?" and frivolous was the adjective that she used. Apparently, Episcopal diocesan operatives had previously informed her that my parish, the Church of the Holy Apostles, being an Anglo-Catholic parish, separated because of the proposed prayer book. I consumed 10 minutes trying to explain to her that it was the priesting of women, not the proposed prayer book, which impelled us to the separation. Although our parish much preferred the 1928 liturgy, liturgical considerations alone were insufficient to cause secession. If the ordering of priestesses had not passed, and the 1979 prayer book had passed, we would have doctored up Rite 1 of the new liturgy to resemble Old Missal Mass and stayed. Liturgical considerations, reductionism in moral principle, and funding of secular radical causes, as important as they were, did not cause the initial secessions in 1977. Biblical and theological reductionism were enablers of the move toward priestesses. And just as radical feminism in our own time has been a stalking horse for unbridled economic redistributionism, so ordination of women, in my view, was the first great stalking horse for secularization of our historic religious witness. I recall two significant moments when the reductionist process asserted itself. The first was at a convention of the Diocese of Los Angeles. We were exhorted to endorse ordination of women in order to provide leadership for the Roman Catholic Church. Can you imagine that? Leadership for the Church of Rome? However, we must remember that this was before the death of Paul VI and during wide reading of Malachi Martin's final conclave, and then the election of the conservative Cardinal Luciani, Patriarch of Venice, altered the ecclesiastical outlook. The September Pope, perhaps murdered by the KGB, we don't know, because there was an attempt to murder his successor. The outlook changed. We don't know what the future holds, incidentally, with the present pontifical regime. The second event which I recall was a speech by Dr. Robert Wright of the General Theological Seminary. It was at the General Convention in Louisville of 1973, in which he asserted that Jesus had failed to call female apostles because he was time conditioned, quote unquote, by his surroundings. Time conditioned. Thus it was that we were to be time conditioned ourselves out of our own priceless theological inheritance, the apostolic faith. And 41 years after the Minneapolis General Convention, the Episcopal Church has not offered one speck of leadership to Rome and Constantinople on the matter of women's ordination. Official Lambeth Conference International Anglicanism has, in effect, severed ecumenical ties with the Catholic bodies of East and West. At this point, I feel we should make an excursus into what happened to the spirit of Anglicanism, as Dr. Michael Ramsey once styled it. Why did it succumb to the purely secular sociological assertion that Jesus was time-conditioned by his surroundings into making an ecclesiastical mistake? How is it that the church of C.S. Lewis, Dorothy Sayers, and T.S. Eliot could so quickly espouse blatant reductionism? Well, first, we should stress that under the stress of the times, there were three individuals who provided leadership in the interwar period: the Inklings, the above-mentioned persons. And the spirit of Anglicanism reached something of an apogee during their time of writing, following the disillusionments of World War I, in which C.S. Lewis himself had served. But concurrent with this was the rise of the Socialist Labour Party in Great Britain and its subsequently profound influence on the universities, especially Cambridge. Steeped in left-wing ideology, and not of the Mauritian sort, I might add, the graduates came into Parliament and onto the bench of bishops. We should keep in mind, friends, that in both the Church of England and the Episcopal Church, the primary pressure for the priesting of women came from the bishops, not from the parochial clergy. In England, the bishops are selected, as most of you know, by Parliament. And Parliament was dominated by Labourite leadership for many of the years after 1945. Labourite thinking utilized several weapons to undermine Orthodox theology. Number one, rampant biblical criticism. Number two, the dogma of the supremely relevant present as opposed to historical Catholic tradition. Number three, espousal of economic redistributionism by force if necessary. Number four, application of so-called situation ethics based upon biblical criticism to the extent that nothing remains fixed in moral requirements. The use of these weapons, resulting in total submission to the zeitgeist, make the demands of inclusiveness irresistible, and demands for inclusiveness remain the primary buttress of the ordination of women. The sinful and awful reality was that by 1969, the Church of England had lapsed into a theological torpor, which my good friend, the late J.V. Langmead Casserly, once described as the thick, clogging soil of outmoded heresy. Isn't that a wonderful way of describing it? Thick, clogging soil, because it was his assertion that there are no new heresies, only the old heresies represented. The Anglican Consultative Council, meeting in Nairobi, Kenya, in 1969, endorsed by a vote of 30 to 29 the ordination of women. And included in the affirmative vote was none other than Dr. Michael Ramsey, the erstwhile darling of Anglo-Catholics, 100th Archbishop of Canterbury, betraying every single theological principle for which he appeared to have stood as Bishop of Durham and assistant at the Queen's side at the coronation. This was decisive for international Anglican thought. Now, the second event of 1969, which I wish to describe, was a meeting of the American Church Union at St. Mary the Virgin in New York in October. This group voted by an identical 30 to 29 to reject affiliation with the Interreligious Foundation of Community Organizations, or IFCO, the same IFCO championed by Saul Alinsky, a known Chicago Marxist. The fact that the ACU, of all organizations, even toyed with the idea of joining IFCO, I found to be utterly appalling. Most of the losing clergy in that ACU vote did not attend St. Louis. I should say none of them did, using the terminology of Alfred Hitchcock. None of them. The prominent rectors of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. remained at home. They accepted the decision of Minneapolis and remained within the fold of the Episcopal Church. After Nairobi, Limuru, and on to the Philadelphia 11 in 1974, it was only a matter of time before the General Synod of the Church of England, loaded down with Laborite bishops, authorized priestesses, the elevation of the Iron Lady in 1979 to 10 Downing Street, to the contrary notwithstanding. Sic transit gloria ecclesiae, sic transit Louis, sic transit Sayers, sic transit Eliot. Gone. Where have all the soldiers gone? The tragic decision of the 1976 General Convention was recognized immediately by the Fellowship of Concerned Churchmen, of which the eminent Mr. Perry Laukoff was president. The FCC was and is an umbrella organization of sodalities and publications dedicated to traditional Anglicanism, of which our own sodality, the American Church Union, was a component. When I say our, I mean ACU. The fellowship issued an instant call for a Congress of Concerned Churchmen to respond to the General Convention. It was scheduled for the exaltation of the Holy Cross, September 14th, 1977. And now I want to add an aside about something which I just learned this evening, that the altar frontal used for the services at this meeting is the same altar frontal that was used at St. Louis, red in color for the exaltation of the Holy Cross. And it shows you that all things come together in a year and a sphere. And I am so pleased to have learned that, Father. The location of the Congress was to be the venerable Chase Park Plaza Hotel, now demolished, I understand. When the idea of the Congress was emerging, it was asserted by many gainsayers that schism would be worse than accepting heresy. This opinion was answered by my late dear friend, the Reverend Dr. Carmino de Catanzaro, sometime professor of Old Testament literature and languages at Seabury Western Seminary, who later served as a continuing bishop in Canada. Dr. de Catanzaro quoted the ancient maxim, "If a portion of the body be diseased, cling to the whole. If the whole of the body be diseased, cling to antiquity." At a meeting of the FCC in Philadelphia in January of 1977, I was invited to serve as chairman of the Committee on Arrangements for the Congress. As a member of the American Church Union, I accompanied its executive director, Father Robert Morse, on visits to several locations in the East to urge attendance at the Congress. We delivered speeches to audiences in Louisville, Kentucky, Coshocton, Ohio, Baltimore, Maryland, Washington, D.C., and Portland, Maine. Attendance at the Congress was not a disappointment, in spite of those glorious East Coast Anglo-Catholic rectors who refused to attend. Over 1,700 clergy and laity were present. The high point of the meeting was an address, in my view, by Professor Thomas Barnes of the University of California at Berkeley on the historical implications of the priesting of women and the theological importance of the Anglican prayer books as opposed to their purely liturgical significance. Following a day of workshops, an affirmation of faith prepared by the fellowship was read to the Congress. It was and is a superb summary of the core beliefs of traditional Anglicans. Now, that is my view, and if it is not your view, well, that's too bad. The initial draft of the affirmation was written by the late Mr. Louis Trasick of the Foundation for Christian Theology. It was modified slightly by a committee of FCC members. To this day, it stands as something of an unofficial constitution of continuing Anglicanism in North America. Initial examination of the affirmation elicited certain concerns over whether we were bordering on confessionalism. Anglicanism has maintained, as most of you know, that it is not a confessional church, not in the Lutheran sense at least. But it was concluded that there was no other way to reassert our traditional beliefs than by some sort of summary statement. One of the disappointments of St. Louis was the absence of the charismatic segment of the Episcopal Church. I found that personally very disappointing. Prior to the Congress, It was thought that charismatics would join in the resistance to priestesses due to their biblical orientation, but such was not the case. A most stirring moment of the Congress was Father Robert Morse's sermon at the closing Eucharist. In his magnificent homily, he urged the faithful to leave the flesh pots of Egypt and to go into the desert to offer worthy sacrifice. The implication of this exhortation was that 40 or more years in the desert might be necessary. And, my dear friends, as we reflect upon it, it appears to have been very necessary. As most of you know, St. Louis did not set in motion a tsunami of secession. Why? Number one, many Episcopalians, although annoyed by the impending suppression of their 1928 morning prayer book, were not outraged by the prospect of priestesses, probably because they couldn't understand why a woman could not be a Protestant Episcopal minister. Two, many rectors and vestries feared legal retaliation by tyrannical diocesan bureaucracies. And three, large numbers of clergy feared interference with their pension benefits. And four, the Congress was too often seen as being in the narrow interest of eccentric Anglo-Catholics, that is we, who had been marginalized in church politics. As things emerged, the anxiety over pension benefits turned out to be misplaced. Following surprisingly short litigation, all priests and bishops vested for 10 years in the pension fund continued to receive their benefits. But the acute concern over legal retaliation proved to be a far more realistic worry. Only a small portion of the 1977 seceding parishes, among them my own future cure of St. Peter's, Oakland, emerged in possession of their property. The so-called Dennis Canon, adopted by the Episcopal Church after St. Louis, almost guaranteed property for the parent body. And I might also add, subsequent to that, the very vague opinion by the U.S. Supreme Court of Jones versus Wolf gave the opportunity to individual state Supreme Courts to use either one of two legal routes to give the property to the parent body, and that opinion hurt us greatly. This reality has become more painfully evident in recent attempts to secede and by the subsequent opinions of state Supreme Courts in favor of the parent body. Very recently, the Supreme Court of South Carolina awarded property to numerous parishes founded in colonial times. This was a very discouraging event, given the fact that it was thought that local churches there had the best chance of retaining their property. The Congress of St. Louis produced not only the enduring affirmation, but several non-geographical jurisdictions. 3 of these, as I understand it, remain active today. On January 28, 1978, 4 bishops were consecrated in Denver, Colorado, in a moving liturgy. I recall so well this service being covered by Walter Cronkite on the CBS Evening News. The consecration was made possible by one of the most courageous and humble prelates I have ever encountered. The Right Reverend Albert Chambers was sometime Bishop of Springfield, Illinois, and rector of the Church of the Resurrection in Manhattan. I had first met Bishop Chambers at an Octave of Unity Mass, when they were holding such things, in Chicago in 1961, same year that I first went to Wrigley Field. At that time, I thought, what a charming and humble man. But humility was not a deterrent to theological courage. Of all the possible Episcopal consecrators after Minneapolis, he and only he had the courage to proceed with the utterly necessary preservation of the episcopacy, reminiscent of Elijah's lament under the juniper tree, and I, even I, only am left one prophet of the Lord. But my friends, that's all it takes. Having done his duty to God and his church, Bishop Chambers returned to private life, never to return to the public arena again. All of us left Denver with high hopes. In the words of the Broadway show, Damn Yankees. But the high hopes were soon dashed by the phenomenon of mitred ambition and ego. This phenomenon involved 2 aspects in my view. Number 1, the refusal of the 4 Denver bishops to collaborate effectively. And 2, the emergence of pontifical ambitions on the part of numerous clergy who had borne the burden and heat of the day. I'm going to address the clergy only in the room. How many times have your laity complained to you about the gospel for Septuagesima? Because it isn't fair. But the church is not based on a fairness doctrine. The foundation is the judgment of Jesus Christ. This ambition we experienced recalls the query of St. Peter to our Lord. Lo, we have forsaken all and followed thee. What shall we have, therefore? Most of you clergy know that in our business, this is called miterosis. Miterosis is a malady which attacks successful and some not so successful priests. It defines success as the donning of cope and mitre and being hailed as leader. To considerable extent, the continuing church sacrificed itself on the altar of human ego. Since 1978, we've been involved in a vociferated movement, top-heavy with mitres. Such a situation has subjected us to much ridicule. After St. Louis, when we pressed Bishop Chambers to consecrate, we were desperately afraid we would be without bishops. What emerged, however, was a plethora of bishops, making us subject to ridicule. All of that being said, this evening we are gathered to commence, hopefully, a new era of self-sacrificing, non-mitosis collaboration. This can prove to be a glorious moment of attitudinal readjustment and suppression of egos. As another dear friend, of many years, Bishop Paul Hewitt has declared to his diocese, we are on the verge of leaving our 40 years in the wilderness and about to enter the promised land. But let us reflect again on our post-St. Louis predicament. We are called to be faithful. I recall myself an interview that was once granted by Mother Teresa of Calcutta to Barbara Walters, Barbara Wawa, in which she asked Reverend Mother, what does it feel like to be so successful? And Mother said, God has not called me to be successful. God has called me to be faithful. In being called to be faithful, we are called to antiquity. We prefer antiquity. We are, in the words of St. Jude's epistle, to contend earnestly for the faith once delivered to the saints, not the demi faith of the now. When I think of faithfulness, I think of contention for the gifts of antiquity. When I think of these gifts, I think of Hagia Sophia and Constantinople and the words of Justinian the Great. Solomon, I have outdone thee. For nearly 1,500 years, the great edifice of Constantinople has withstood hundreds of earthquakes. I consider it one of the chief joys of my life to have stood within its walls and gazed upon one of the few frescoes uncovered since 1453. Of course, it depicts the Blessed Mother, the Theotokos. This prompts me to inquire, how and why was Orthodoxy able to survive the awful onslaught of the Ottoman Turk and for the Orthodox faith to survive? It was because the believers did not alter their expression of faith. They did not accommodate the spirit of the age. They remained, in the words of a Latin cardinal, Ottaviani, semper idem, always the same. Several years ago, There appeared an article in the Church Times of London, an article about the attitude of the Eastern bodies toward ordination of women. And the author said, the Eastern bodies are never going to ordain women. And when we say never, we mean never, 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 never. Time conditioned? Is the Orthodox Church time conditioned by its existential surroundings? The spirit of the age? Theological compromise simply was not a possibility for the Orthodox under the Turk. And then, after the great Battle of Navarino Bay in 1828 and the subsequent independence of the Greek state, the Orthodox Church was freer to express itself and to continue its ecumenical witness. Hagia Sophia stands today as a theological as well as a physical resistor of earthquakes. All of us assembled here upon this day look to the real Catholic tradition of the Church, and right now it is not to be found in official Anglicanism. I underline official. It is to unofficial Anglicanism that we hope the witness will be preserved. We are on the verge, then, of surviving as traditional Anglicanism. And we will survive if we come together in joy and peace and suppress our egos. I believe that as we approach the immediate future, we must continue to say no. There is in theology a principle, the via negativa, the achievement of positive truth through the rejection and denial of falsehood. You remember those depictions of the Blessed Trinity in the triangle, and in each arm of the triangle it says, non est, non est, non est. The via negativa to positive truth. The authorities of international Anglicanism of the present tell us that we are not Anglicans. We are not Anglicans because we have not succumbed to the zeitgeist. And that is the challenge which we face. As an almost octogenarian thing, I do not care what they say about us. Maybe they should spell our name right. But we, as we come together, witness to antiquity. We are called to the joys of antiquity. And as an history buff bigot, I do not apologize for that position. If we do so, it doesn't matter whether we survive as an external group. What matters is that we have been faithful and die in the faith, professing our Lord Jesus Christ. And in that, we have nothing ever to lose. Thank you very much.